So it's time for the final Titans mini set Fall of Uldurar card review, and I got a lot of cards this time. I missed yesterday's reviews because I was visiting family, so we got 4 classes: Mage, Paladin, Death Knight, and Priest, including this Priest legendary here you see behind me, which is Soul Burner Varia. I love the look of this character. That looks awesome. She is a 3-mana 1/5 undead, and she reads, after a friendly undead dies, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero and get a random Shadow Priest spell. So this seems like a very natural fit for Undead Priest, which is actually still like a tier 2 deck right now at Diamond to Legend. It's not one I hardly ever see, I feel like, on ladder, but still a viable option. And this fits in a couple different ways. Number one, that deck has a lot of undead, and number two, that deck certainly has some Priest Shadow spells, which aren't always necessarily going to line up well, but a lot of them actually do synergize fairly well, and still just, you know, extra value and utility. What you actually care most about here is probably the damage, because that deck can push out a lot of aggression. Now, I will say for Soul Burner Varia, there's a bit of awkwardness here in activating this effect. When we think about like High Cultist Basilief, another legendary in that deck, that card's awesome because, you know, you play out your undead. Once your opponent kills them on their turn, you can bring them back with your Basilief on the next turn. So you don't have to activate them or trade them in yourself, and Basilief as this big payoff legendary still makes it worth it. With Soul Burner Varia, that's far less likely to happen, because if you play this out, you know, with a bunch of undead, your opponent's probably going to end up killing this first and then resolving all your undead later so that this effect doesn't go off, which means very often what's going to happen is you'll have to hope that your undead stick around, and then you play Varia and you have to figure out how or why your undead are dying. Are you trading them in? Well, that goes a little bit at odds with the game plan of this deck, which is to push a ton of face damage. You can say, okay, look, I'm going to trade in all these small undead, still manage the board, and exchange that for face damage. So Varia is almost like a hedge of sorts that allows you to kind of trade without sacrificing your game plan, which is nice, but I bet you'll still wish very often that you could still go face with both. If it was possible and you could push even more damage, you would. But there are, you know, ways to help and support that game plan a little bit. You know, if your opponent has taunts and you want to trade it anyway, A+, right? With things like Mindseer as a spell, you might go face and then Mindseer your own minion. That deals face damage. Varia deals face damage. So you could almost use it as like a finisher of sorts that's allowing you to push a lot of extra damage. Or, you know, you could also just tempo it out and say 5 health might be enough sometimes. I think it's going to stick, and then I've, you know, going to punish the opponent a little bit if they want to clean up other sorts of things. So I do like this as kind of a last ditch, maybe not last ditch, but a finisher of sorts that either allows you to maybe extract more value if you feel like you're not going to get there, they just have too much health, I need more spells, I need more stuff, or alternatively, I got to deal with this board. You know, she kind of creates backup plans of sorts, and sometimes allows you to be a finisher if you have the right complement of spells in hand that can clear up your own sort of stuff. So I think that's cool. I think that's probably going to end up being worth a spot just because she does so much. If it was like either or of these effects, this card might not be good enough, but with both in combination, feels like there's enough game states where she makes sense. So I think I do here like Soul Burner Varia as a card. Next up here is the Shadow Touched Cavaldir, a 1-mana 1/3 undead. Another awesome looking card. She's got Battle Cry. Your next healing effect deals damage instead. So back to like Auchenai Soul Priest days, but this is only for 1 healing effect, which is nice. You still get the upside of doing it, but you don't feel like your whole turn is locked out where you can't do other things if life gets awkward. And, you know, this is a hard one because there's a lot of, you know, things that heal friendly characters specifically. You know, for instance, you're not running this with the Location Fan Club, probably, because this is wiping out your own cards. Although there is a world where maybe you use that with our previous card, Kill Off Your Undead. I don't think that's going to be good. That's too many cards. It's too much commitment to a game plan for that. But, you know, keep that in mind as like a finisher sort of thing, combo sort of thing. More realistically, there's cards like Funnel Cake, right? This can be used on any minion. So suddenly with Funnel Cake and Shadow Touch Cavaldir, you've got yourself a 2-mana thing that's going to clean up a bunch of 3/3s on board. Yeah, you're not getting the overheal, obviously, but you can kind of turn this into removal instead of otherwise. We've also just got cards like Flash Heal still in Hearthstone. So, you know, Flash Heal is just 5 damage to the face now for 1 mana with the Shadow Touch Cavaldir, which The limitations on this might prevent that from being any sort of combo that just kills you, because it's hard to get enough Cavaldiers and enough flash heals and stuff. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. A control priest could suddenly manifest like 10 damage out of nowhere, if they have these sorts of cards in their deck, if they think the Cavaldier is offering enough extra utility on top of their other stuff. So there are definitely some cards and scenarios that do seem to enable the Cavaldier. I think the real question is, are you willing to run a card that has such a situational nature, where it's only good in specific scenarios and in combination with specific cards? Control Priest might actually be able to do that, just because they have so much value they can generate. This wouldn't necessarily be a huge sacrifice. And sometimes just playing down a 1/3 doesn't feel all that bad. So the stat line on this being nice could help, sometimes just being a tempo play with that additional upside later. This is also something that bakes into future turns. So if you plan on using a heal anytime soon, you can just play this on 1/3 on turn 1, and then just save that removal up for later. And you're just baking it in while also getting an extra body on board, which I think actually feels pretty nice. So I don't know, this card, although situational, it does feel like it offers some really specific utility that will occasionally be nice. And when attached to a good stat line, that makes me hopeful for it. So moving on here to the Twilight Torrent. This is a new 2-mana shadow spell. Again, the artwork on this is sick. These priest cards look cool this time. This one allows you to choose a character. If it's friendly, you'll restore 6 health, or if it's an enemy, you will deal 3 damage. Do not use this in combination with your Shadow Touched Cavaldier, because it's gonna deal 3 damage to the enemy anyway, or kill something of yours with 6 damage. I mean, maybe not the most synergistic pieces here, but that's okay. But I like Twilight Torrent here. I think this is nice. Deal 3 damage for 2. It's not exciting anymore in Hearthstone, but I think it's still solid, and particularly for things like a Shadow Undead Priest, just another way to do damage potentially that could be rather nice. I don't know that the 6 health feels worth it necessarily, because you're very rarely going to care about healing. But if there is a minion on board you really want to protect, you think you've got something nice and valuable there, you might occasionally decide that the 6 health healing is worth a little bit more than the 3 damage. But I think most often this card's going to feel like it's aggressively aligned. I think this is a card that actually doesn't show up in deck lists too often, because I'm not sure it does enough. But like off Discover effects, randomly generating it off your Varia, it's going to feel great. This is going to be the card that you're like, oh yeah, okay, nice. That's the sort of damage I'm looking for. Also, just in like your Svalna pools, like Sister Svalna, right? This is gonna be an awesome card, because if you need life gain, boom, I'm gonna take the Torrent. If I need damage later, I'm gonna stack up on these off my Svalnas, and then I can use these as a control deck if needed, or I can turn the corner and hit people as needed. So this is like an A+ sort of Discover card, I think. A little bit worse when it comes to deck building, which is how we review and rate cards traditionally. So maybe not the highest score on this one, but I think actually still a good card, and one that's important to exist. So moving on to Death Knight here, we've got a couple cards I think that are meant to support Rainbow Death Knight, and particularly the card Climactic Necrotic Explosion, the big 10-mana spell that wants you to spin corpses. But I don't think they're going to be enough to get that deck there. We'll talk about it. There's always a but, right? For instance, this is Sinister Soul Cage, a 4-mana single unholy rune. Good for Rainbow DK. Shadow spell, and give a friendly undead +2/+2. Spin 5 corpses to summon a copy of it. So at a base level, giving a friendly undead +2/+2, that's not a very good play, right? We don't like to see that. And then spin 5 corpses to summon a copy of it. That's a little more exciting. That's kind of in that germination space, like that old druid card, 4 mana, summon a copy. Give it taunt, I think it was. So like a little more interesting there, buff and a copy together. But as we've seen with these cards a lot in the past, sometimes they're just really clunky to play, because obviously you want to copy higher value and often higher cost targets, which means if you're playing both of them in the same turn, that's kind of pushing this back in the game a little bit. If you're copying lower value targets, it's often not worth the 4 mana to actually copy it. The buff probably helps offset that feeling a little bit, but I think still probably not enough. So you really are looking for things that maybe have like cost reductions, something like a Stitched Giant maybe, but that's a double unholy card. So suddenly this is more of an unholy specific thing instead of a rainbow thing, which that's fine technically and potentially, but are there other good cards in this deck? Can you add consistency in an unholy deck for something like Sinister Soul Cage? Or do you want to run more minions to generate more corpses? Because if you get an imbalance on corpse spenders versus corpse generators, you've got a problem. And when things like this are attached to spells, sometimes it can be hard to actually get enough bodies and enough corpses down. So ultimately for me, the payoff on this is just a little awkward. It's basically like a Germinate, but they added multiple conditions to it. You suddenly have to have 5 corpses to make the spell worth it at all, which sometimes will whiff. And it has to be a friendly undead, which just really limits your use cases on this. You can't use it on like your Titan, for instance. It just doesn't work because it's not an undead. So I don't know, man, taking a mediocre spell and making it sort of better with a +2/+2, but also making it way more conditional seems like it really restricts the number of decks that can utilize this and the number of game states that can utilize this as well. It just feels like it's going to kind of fail out in a lot of turns and a lot of moments. So I don't think this looks very good, basically. Moving on to Runes of Darkness. This is another one that I think could be a Rainbow DK support card. 1 mana Blood Rune, Shadow. Discover a weapon and spend 3 corpses to give it +1/+1. So a little bit of overhead here for you to get a weapon that might be useful. And you know, some corpse expenditure as well to make that weapon a little bit better. Maybe make it feel like you're kind of getting your 1 mana value back here on spending this up front. You know, I actually think this card's okay. You know, making your weapon better can definitely go a long way. You think about a card like Ashbringer, for instance, it actually makes that kind of a crazy monster weapon, like big time heals, crazy damage output. So, you know, I think there are some moments where this feels fine, and little discover stuff like this we can often just kind of toss into decks. I don't know that this really, again, helps Necrotic Explosion DK all that much. This feels like maybe a card Blood just, you know, sometimes finds a home for, depending on the size and efficiency of the weapon pool. Just how good does it feel? So it's okay. Again, though, I don't think this card is outstanding or really a standout in any way. So next up, we've got the Sickly Grime Walker, a 3 mana 2/4 undead. After you summon an undead, give it poisonous. And this is another single unholy rune on this one. And I mean, theoretically allows you to turn some of your swarmy undead boards into you know, I guess the ability to trade into your opponent's stuff and utilize that. I mean, there are some obvious combinations here with like the hero power in Death Knight. That's an undead with charge, so you know you could use that to trade in. But that's kind of a 5 mana remove a thing, which it just doesn't feel that good these days in Hearthstone. And yeah, if you leave this behind, it's kind of sometimes useful, but I just don't know how useful it's going to feel to get poisonous on stuff that's often going to be delayed in attacking. There are some ways to get rush undead, obviously in Death Knight, but still, it's just such an overhead just to help you trade a little bit more efficiently. And if Death Knight's planning to play from behind a lot, is an undead deck the best way to do that? Is an undead deck playing from so far ahead that a card like this just feels like it's sitting dead in hand too often, and that kind of reactive swing potential doesn't really need to exist. I'm afraid the second part of that is more true, that if you're gonna have enough undead to make this feel consistently good, it's probably just not a deck that wants to be playing from behind. And if it does, you'd rather just have cards that help you stay ahead, as opposed to maybe kind of sort of recover, but very conditionally, and only if you have like exactly Army of the Dead or something in hand. And even that is an 8 mana play. So all of these cards just, I hate to be a downer, but I feel like they could all be like a little cheaper, a little bit less conditional, and I would all feel a little bit better. As it stands, they all just seem way too honest and fair. All right, so next up here, we got some Paladin cards. This is Keeper's Strength, a 4 mana holy spell. Give a friendly minion +2/+2 and deal its attack damage to all other minions. Remember, that will hit your own stuff as well, except for the card being targeted. This kind of has like Shadow Flame vibes a little bit, or almost like inverse Shadow Flame. Shadow Flame kills the minion. This might kill your other minions, but using a minion anyway to clean up a board, which could be nice if you fall behind on board and something like a pure Paladin. You know, you got your Light Ray that's been cost reduced. You slam that down, you buff it, that becomes 7 damage. Boom, you swing the board back while starting with a low cost card. Maybe even have a couple spare mana or something to play more stuff behind that. There could be scenarios where it's hard to find the right cost or shape of target for this. You know, if you're on turn 5 and need to clear the board and you're behind, which you're often going to be if you need to clear a board, it's like, what do I play alongside the Keeper's Strength? I don't have a minion right now that makes this good enough. Okay, I got a Righteous Protector, but 3 damage maybe isn't enough to clean up everything, and I feel like I haven't really achieved much with my Keeper's Strength. So the high cost on this that's required in combination with a minion, I think, is going to make this feel rather awkward sometimes. There are, you know, awesome big minions too. People have talked about with like earthens and stuff with this, but that means you need to have a minion left behind very often, because the earthen cards summon their effects after death rattle or at the end of turn, which again, that's going to be hard to activate all at once with keeper strength without something lasting into the next turn. So I don't know, there's some weird kind of like, you need minions on board for this to feel good, but it's only good maybe when you're behind on board a lot. There is a middle ground there, obviously, where you have a little bit of stuff or one or two things survives, or the light rays like we talked about. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think there's gonna be a lot of turns where you don't need this because you're ahead, and a lot of turns where when you're behind, it just doesn't work as well as you want. And I think it's gonna fall in the gaps a little too often for that. So it is a high output card. I wouldn't be shocked if this feels really good sometimes off like discover effects and randomly generated. I don't know that decks are going to have game plans that want to run this super consistently though. So moving on to the Alarmed Security Bot. This is a 4-mana 4/3 mech, and Death Rattle, draw another minion, set its attack, health, and cost to 5. So this is kind of a maybe a little helpful curve filler where you've got your turn 4 and then you've got your turn 5. Probably feels best when you're cheating something big and awesome with a really cool effect into play early. So you grab a Titan, even just grabbing like a Leviathan Colossus. I actually think Thaddeus sounds like a really cool idea for the Alarm Security Bot. If you hit a Thaddeus on turn 5, play a Thaddeus, you could make some like monster swings off of a card like this one. I actually kind of want to build a deck that's like only this and Thaddeus and a bunch of non-minions to see if you can like pop off on turn 5 or something, maybe even turn 6, depending on which cost alignment you're looking for or makes the most sense. But anyway, that's pretty specific, and I don't think it will really be like a good sort of deck, a good meme perhaps. Using this more realistically, I like that this has the fallback where if you hit a low cost card, you know, you kind of bump that low cost card up into a viable 5-drop. So if you hit a Righteous Protector, it becomes a 5/5 that you can play on turn 5 and maybe not feel as bad, but that still doesn't feel good. It's really going to be about cheating those really valuable effects, not stats, into play a turn sooner. So I think this is some kind of idea here in a big deck of sorts. I don't think this feels great though in that case, because you know the turn 4 play you're making is pretty weak. Thankfully this doesn't draw itself, because it does say draw another minions that allows you to add, you know, consistently putting 2 of these in. It's just that Big Paladin is not an archetype that makes a lot of sense right now, and I don't really anticipate that changing a ton. So Alarm Security Bot in the world where it makes most sense, it's just not a context right now that's very supportive for this card. It just, you know, unlikely to be a good meta relevant card, even if it does fit fairly well in that environment. So moving on here to the Muscleotron. He is a 3-mana 2/4 mech with Battlecry. Give all minions in your hand +1/+1 and Forge +2/+2 instead. So man, at surface level, I think this card looks pretty weak. This is the exact same effect as a 2-mana minion that is currently in standard format and getting played in Paladin. The Grime Street dude, here he is. I'm pulling him up, sorry. Grime Street Offender, give all minions in your hand +1/+1. And like, yeah, okay, am I spending 1 extra mana to get 2 health on this dude? That feels kind of bad. Now, you do have the option of Forge, right? So you can spend an additional 2 mana to make this a 5-mana card that gives +2/+2. But my God, then you're pushing this pretty far back into the game for your swing turns, because suddenly it's, you know, you passed turn 2, you played something terrible on turn 3, because you only played a 2/4. And then turn 4, you're finally playing the buffed, hand buffed stuff, maybe even if it's a couple things, right? You're getting kind of 4/4 cheated into play. And then it takes another turn very often for those cards to actually attack and interact. So you've kind of skipped almost like turns 2 through 4, which obviously are some of the most important turns when you're talking about stat-based approaches with something like a hand buff deck that needs their stats to get into play. So in a lot of ways, like there is a cool curve like 2/3 on this, but it just feels like it's going to come down too late in those scenarios. It is cool too that like hand buff, you want more stuff in hand, so kind of delaying that makes kind of sense, like forging into it later. Like, I get it, right? I get it. I just don't think the numbers are going to be there to push this fast enough. If this minion itself had a better stat line that didn't make it feel like you were sacrificing so much on your turn 3, for instance, that could definitely help. If this were 2 mana to start, it might still help you, because like on turn 3 you could play like a Righteous Protector alongside it, you know. So a number tweak here or there would make me feel a little bit better about the Muscleotron, but I think most decks aren't willing to give up such key turns when it comes towards like jostling board and and really trying to win that early momentum, this maybe just hits at the wrong time, even if the curve kind of lines up. So I think, just going with a safer, faster approach with stuff like Grime Street Outfitter gets there, and you maybe don't need both of those. You need enough hand buff and enough payoff. You can't have an imbalance there. So for me, I think sticking with what we have and what we know is a little bit better. This might be just a little bit too punishing on giving up so much tempo. So moving over to Mage here, we've got the Void Scripture, a 2-mana shadow spell. Discover a spell. If you have enough mana to play it, cast a copy of it at a random enemy. So we got some nice discover here. We got a shadow spell, which could definitely be relevant for rainbow, like Sif Mage stuff, which we have shadow spells already with reverberations, but it doesn't necessarily hurt to have an extra one in this case. And of course, discovering spells can still be very useful for that sort of deck as well, and just generating lots of cool stuff. And then getting a nice copy of things is great too. So this might be something you're willing to play on turn 2 just to kind of get your shadow spell in the pool and get things moving. But then it also perhaps feels good on turn 6, turn 7, because you might get an extra copy of a board clear or a minion summon or some damage that you hope hits face or cleans up a minion, right? There's a lot of great options here for the Void Scripture. Or you might get a spell that discovers more spells and you're just happy to generate additional value for free off of your Void Scripture. Do keep in mind that for stuff like Romath, the copy will not count on the Romath. We had the same discussion with these Yogg cards, but if the card is what's casting a spell, it is not tracked for cards later that care about you casting spells. When a card casts a spell, you did not cast it, the card did. So don't come at me with these. If you want it to work that way, that's fine. They just historically have not. So I don't expect this would work with a Romath sort of thing, weaving extra spells in. But you don't need it to, right? I think this card is still pretty cool. And this one feels good to me because of that flexibility, both early and late. Still feels like a useful thing. And a big shadow in particular is what's really helpful about that aspect, giving you a nice spell school bonus there. Earlier in the game, you hit your like creations on turn 4 more reliably, that sort of thing. Feels good because of Void Scripture on 2, and it's still great late. So next up here is the Tainted Remnant. This card's really cool. A 5-mana 7/4 elemental battle cry. If you played an elemental last turn, deal 7 damage, randomly split between all enemies. So some elemental support for Mage. This looks like scary good on an empty board. If you've managed to get out ahead and are like getting some elementals down early and are keeping things in check, 7 damage to the face, I'm up for that. That actually looks pretty cool. Maybe even if you're just clearing up a few smaller minions alongside it and get 3 or 4 damage to the face, that's pretty cool. And with elementals, we actually have ways to cheat stuff into place. This could be coming down even earlier than turn 5 in Mage, which makes it feel even swingier. And if they can't deal with it, 7 damage attack is kind of nuts. So there's like something here. I think the card itself is kind of cool and surprisingly threatening because of these 7 damages on it. That said, Elemental Mage is not a thing, right? And it hasn't been a thing, and they've been printing these like little elemental cards here and there. Maybe we're going to get some enormous payoff on this elemental package in the near future, and it's like all of these are laying in wait to get there. But for now, we can't really trust that this elemental thing makes any sense. And building a deck with enough elementals to feel like this is hitting consistently early enough, it's just not going to happen based on what we see in Hearthstone right now. So this is a card that definitely feels a little bit hamstrung by its conditionality and its synergy requirements. Although I think the outputs on this one do kind of make sense, especially if you're cheating it into play early. That is a very scary kind of swing and a very threatening sort of minion on board. It feels like maybe like a Goblin Blast Mage of sorts, which, probably, if I think about it, is an unfair comparison to this because that's like an 8-year-old card. Or maybe even 9-year-old card now. This isn't that much better than, so I don't know, maybe I'm overrating this a little bit, but 7 damage is still a lot. So then our final card here is the Meddlesome Servant, a 3-mana 3/4 battle cry. If you've cast 5 or more spells this game, draw 2 cards, and we've seen a handful of these 5 or more spells this game. Certainly in Mage, 5 or more spells seems very achievable compared to some of the other cards we've seen in this idea. I don't think Mage has any trouble at all getting to 5 spells. That's it. They do, still need turns to get to 5 spells. This is not a card, for instance, you're playing on turn 3 when you're most excited to play it. This is a card you're probably playing turn 5, turn 6, turn 7 and sorts as a bit of a reload then. And then I have to say, I'm less enthused about a 3-mana 3/4 that late in the game that's drawing me 2 cards, just because Mage has a lot of ways to draw cards, They just have so many different options. And if you think about a card like Volume Up right now that Mage is using to draw cards, you know, that sounds like a big sacrifice. Oh man, 4 mana, you know, like, yeah, I get more cards. I'm kind of not getting any bodies on board, but you are, because of the Mage weapon. You get a 4/4 very often when you play Volume Up. And it's like Meddlesome Servant, you know, that's a 3/4. I'd rather get more cards, get a copy of a card, and get a 4/4 in many cases than just play this like 3/4 Meddlesome Servant that's conditional and gets me fewer cards. I don't know. In the current shape of Mage, like, I actually don't think this really makes sense or gets there. You know, it feels bad to say that a 3-mana 3/4 that draws you 2 cards isn't quite good enough to keep up with Mage. I think that's true at the moment. That said, you know, that combo, that sequencing may not always be around. Maybe Meddlesome Servant finds a gap somewhere where this is the right kind of card. And it's just maybe a fine draw option for Mage in the mid game. So I don't think this is bad by any means. A lot about this makes sense. I just don't think it's ideal for Mage at the moment, and maybe even into the future. Soul Burner Varia is a 4-star card. Shadow Touch Cavaldier is a 4-star card. Twilight Torrent is a 3-star card. Sinister Soul Cage is a 2-star card. Runes of Darkness is a 3-star card. Sickly Grimewalker is a 2-star card. Keeper's Strength is a 3-star card. Alarmed Security Bot is a 3-star card. Muscleotron is a 2-star card. Void Scripture is a 4-star card. Tainted Remnant is a 3-star card. Meddlesome Servant is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for our Titans mini set card reviews. What do you think? How good are these cards going to be? How much are these going to get played? I think there's a mixed bag here. I feel like, you know, we got some stuff that looks pretty strong to me. I think, as always, there's probably going to be 4 or 5 cards that really stand out and get a lot of play. I think it fell off pretty hard, though. I didn't feel like there was a lot of middle-of-the-road cards this time around. A lot of stuff I don't know. I'm very confident it's going to get played anytime soon, if ever. A lot of these mini-set cards can be forgotten. So maybe a bit, you know, a high peak, and then, you know, a lot of stuff that's maybe not so good. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm curious if you think the same or if you think there's a lot of options here. So all that said, thanks much as always for watching. Stay tuned. I'm going to actually try to play a lot of Hearthstone this next week with these new cards, planning some streams and some duels runs and stuff. So stay tuned. I'll actually hopefully have a lot of videos moving forward. That said, thank you. Stay tuned. Love you. And until next time, game on.